Well, thanks everyone and welcome. My name is Kaylee Meeks. I'm part of Weitzman Student Services. My title is Director of Professional Development and Leadership. So I'm so excited to be here as a part of this career panel with our wonderful alumni. We have Héctor Berdecía-Hernández, Nate Hammitt, Cara Bertron, and Arielle Harris. And so myself and Randy Mason, who's director of the Department of Historic Preservation, will both be asking our wonderful guests questions during this session. So while we let Randy log on, I will get started and I'll go alphabetically, so Héctor will be first. But the first question is to say a few words about the nature of your work as you currently practice it, meaning what you do, the scope of your work, what drew you to the field, and why you decided to pursue preservation as a profession. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kelly. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Héctor Berdecía-Hernández. I'm from Puerto Rico. I graduated from the Penn program in 2020. Right now, I'm the Director General of the Centro de Conservación y Restauración de Puerto Rico, which is a new regional conservation center here in Puerto Rico that serves both the Caribbean region and the south side of the United States. So just to give you a little bit of the work that I do, I'm sharing this quick. So I'm an architectural conservator by training, so I managed to work with a lot of the projects, but at the same time, I work with the staff, I work with budgets, project management, administrative stuff, legal stuff, as executive director. So my work encompasses both worlds, both the hands-on and the architectural conservation, materials conservation projects. The center that I lead has different departments. So we work on buildings and sites, historic buildings and sites with scientific research, preservation of art collections and archives, museums, libraries, apprenticeship and training on traditional trades, and also the different publications, seminars, and conferences. So my work is a lot in the private sector, but also it encompasses a lot of institutional work within cultural institutions. My background was in architecture. I graduated from the University of Puerto Rico, and I knew that I wanted to jump in to study history preservation. At Penn, I learned about architectural materials conservation, and that's how I end up, being an architectural conservator.
Great, thank you. I think Cara is next.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cara Bertron. I'm really pleased to be here across all of your spaces with you. I graduated from the Historic Preservation Program in 2011, and now I work for the City of Austin, Texas, in the Historic Preservation Office. So I started out with the city about 8 years ago as a case manager, so managing historic district zoning, changes to historic properties, reviewing potential landmarks. After a few years of that, I worked in the city's displacement prevention division. So I was managing a displacement prevention navigator pilot program, helping people to stay in place and helping to support a rental assistance program during COVID. Then I came back to the Historic Preservation Office to manage the development and implementation of the city's new equity-based preservation plan. The preservation plan, it's won multiple national awards. It was written over about 4 years by a community working group, which is really unusual for a city plan. It was adopted about a year ago. And the plan really maps out how historic preservation can be a tool for equitable cultural and community preservation in the middle of a rapidly changing landscape here in Austin. So it looks at how to do what we're already doing better, and also how to expand what's considered important and how to invite new people to participate in preservation and to make it more relevant. So my role is really leading implementation of that plan, and this includes some very pragmatic improvements to current functions, and and also doing some work to reinvent what preservation looks like and who it's relevant to. It's really, really interesting and exciting work. What drew me to the preservation field, I've always been interested in buildings and stories. I grew up in a house in Central Texas that my parents built, so that was, from the beginning, I was living in a place and experiencing a place that was built around my family's stories. And I thought I'd study architecture in college, but I ended up studying urban planning and English instead. And the planning and English fields just got closer and closer together through various jobs, until I ended up at historic preservation, kind of by accident, in a way that weaves together place and story. Um, I've done a lot of things since then. My first formal preservation job was working at Page and Turnbull, which is a consulting firm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we did a lot of work for municipal governments and developers. But I was really interested in how historic preservation could work for communities that didn't have a lot of resources. And that's why I came to UPenn, is to really explore, how preservation could be accessible to and useful to communities. Um, I finished my master's degree, as I mentioned, in 2011, and then I did a variety of work. So I worked on historic preservation in legacy cities, older industrial cities, with the Preservation Right Sizing Network, which is an organization I co-founded, and also with Donovan Ripkema at Place Economics, which was really exciting. I worked with Randy Mason on a new survey model, and then I spent several years working on community development and neighborhood planning in Seattle in the Chinatown International District. And I came back to Austin about 8 years ago and have been with the city ever since. A real variety of work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I believe Nate is up.
Great. Thanks, Callie. Sure, happy to share my own experience. I came into preservation almost by accident, but grew up overseas in South Africa back in the 90s, which is a big time of change in another part of the world, and moved from South Africa to Cincinnati, Ohio, where in the spirit of the Rust Reformation, I was exposed to a lot of history and challenges with the existing building fabric of a mid-sized American city. And I think I can share some images, Callie, if you have any ability to pull something up. But from that background, really was captivated by the transformation of Cincinnati's historic building stock, and made a trip back to South Africa to see how post-apartheid South Africa had transformed substantially, and wanted to, after going through architecture school, pursue a program that had a expertise in preservation and architecture. So when I was there, it was a time of really substantial change for Philadelphia. There were 32 schools that were closed in 2013 while I was a student at Penn. And part of that, I think crisis breeds opportunity sometimes, where it was a major, major shock to the city, but it was also a really pressing question that begged a preservation and design response. So you can go through the next few images here, Callie, but my time at Penn, graduated in 2016, which is when Bach was being redeveloped for a new community hub. Abandoned classrooms and theaters were converted into spaces for creative professionals, for community gatherings, even for public meetings, like that image there in the bottom right. But that building has evolved over the years, and it's been fun to see that was a thesis project that turned into something real. I was a very small part of the development team, but worked as a student to help with some of the building assessments and creative reuse opportunities. So, yeah, next slide here. But coming to that point, I think I mentioned a few different experiences and exposure. In addition to what I shared, I did undergrad in architecture, so I had the opportunity to work with GBBN architects in Cincinnati on music halls renovation, and then took two international co-ops, which would be study abroad. One was in Bogota, in Colombia, with the Penn architecture program, and got to work with an architect in the adaptive reuse for an old textile industrial facility in Bogota. And then in the bottom right, had the chance to work on one of Louis Kahn's buildings in Fort Wayne, Indiana, for part of their creative arts hub restoration and urban planning projects. So yeah, I think this is just an image here showing some experiences as I've worked my way through school and prior to graduation. But I've got some images here, Callie, showing a little bit more on post-graduation. I've moved through roles working with community partners in Philadelphia area after graduation. This is a project in the suburbs of Philadelphia that was taking two old community, abandoned community buildings, both schools, and combining them into a new community center. So we worked with it was in Middletown, Pennsylvania, their library foundation and the state's the state's education, Department of Education, to secure a grant for adaptive reuse of an old library into a community center. So that image in the top right shows how the two historic buildings were linked together, but the one from the mid-century there that on the far left was in a pretty advanced state of disrepair. If you go to the next image, Callie, we were able to transform that mid-century building that was not listed but had some really good bones into a new community asset. So this is one of my first projects out of school that was using architecture and preservation experience for more of a community focus, working closely with nonprofits and media. And then after leaving Philadelphia, I worked for about a year at a hotel brand. So I worked as the in-house architect for 21C, which is a national hotel brand that focuses primarily on historic properties and historic tax credit renovations from older, usually abandoned buildings for new reuse as hospitality concepts in hotels. And then after that experience, I've been with an architecture firm in Louisville, Kentucky, where I currently work. On the next image here, Callie, of firm is called Work Architecture, and we do about 50% historic project, 50% new construction. But this is an image of Hotel Covington just outside Cincinnati that was converted from an old YMCA into a new hotel. And then some other images here. We took on a historic landmark in a local Louisville landmark that was perched on the bank of the Ohio River in an advanced state of decay that was built by a notable local architect. And just as an example of what we tend to take on private sector, transform this into the next image, which was reused for a new event venue that makes reuse of that building for events in the Louisville area. And I think after that, only other image after that, you keep going. We do new construction in historic environments. So this is, 50% of what I do is new construction. But we really do try to think about how we are in a position where we have to consider the context. And as a company, we're a firm of 12, but we did, I think it was 40% of the state's historic tax credit applications last year. So Kentucky is its own unique place, but we've found a niche doing a lot of historic work and work in historic environments. Oh yeah, and this is for an old industrial building for University of Louisville, just to show off this is an old brownfield site converted for the Fine Arts campus at U of L. I think that's it. Thanks, Callie. Oh, lost your audio there.
Sorry about that. Arielle, you're next. Thank you.
Sounds good. Let me share my slides. All right, everyone. Thank you for having me, Randy and Penn. It's great to be here. My name is Arielle Harris, and I'm excited to kind of share my career journey with you as well. I overlapped with Nate for a year. Even though he was in the dual degree program, he graduated a year before me. So I graduated from Penn in 2017. So prior to coming to Penn, I definitely knew I had an interest in the history of architecture, but I was sort of weighing the academia track versus the praxis track, or, being more engaged, beyond the ivory tower. And I began my investigation of what I want to do in undergrad. I sort of fell into architectural history by accident too. I was talking about the neighborhood where I grew up on the shuttle bus between Haverford and Bryn Mawr College. I went to undergrad at Haverford, and someone said, "Oh, you should take a class in the Growth and Structure of Cities department." And that was it for me. I found it. And so my undergraduate thesis, I wrote about the spatial distribution of the federal historic tax credit projects in Philadelphia. And through that, I landed an internship and then later a full-time job at a preservation consulting firm in Washington, D.C. called EHT Traceries. I initially did a combination of GIS analysis and historic property research, but then I sort of became trained as a project assistant, learned how to do all of the fun things you will learn in the documentation class at Penn, like doing a chain of title and learning how to, trace property ownership and learning how to write architectural descriptions, things like that. And where I stood at the end of that time in my life was the push-pull of Secretary of Interior qualification timelines for me. I don't know if those words have been buzzed around with you today in the open house, but essentially for the federal government to consider you as a qualified architectural historian, you either need a certain number of years of work experience or you need a graduate degree plus experience. And just given that it would be faster for me to get the SOI qualification, if I went to grad school, I then decided to take the plunge and apply to preservation programs. And so I spent a year kind of working part-time. I lived with my mom, took the GRE, found lots of different opportunities to volunteer in New York, including as a tour guide of Grand Central Terminal, which was really fun. Also, the local neighborhood history group in my mom's neighborhood needed some extra hands to help process some documents that they were donating to their neighborhood library branch, so I helped with that. And these were all things that set me up really well for a wonderful 2 years at Penn. At Penn, I was in the preservation planning track. The public history of the built environment track was not in existence when I was at Penn. I probably would have focused more on that had I been there. However, I did pursue a certificate in urban redevelopment as well, which enabled me to take classes. I took one class at Wharton, I think 2 classes at Fells, which is the school for the Masters of Public Administration degree. So I took a nonprofit administration class, and then preservation economics and property development in the city planning department. So that helped round out the certificate for me. I was a TA for 2 courses, and then sort of dove in headfirst in the Philadelphia preservation advocacy world here. And over the summer between my first and second years, I interned at the Philadelphia City Planning Commission, but then on my own, also submitted a nomination to the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places, which is the photo you see in the slide here. This is a building on LaSalle University's campus, and they, similar to other institutions like Penn, Temple, Drexel, have had a mixed bag of preservation successes and and balancing that with urban expansion. So I was able to make sure that this house did not turn into a parking lot, which I was very pleased about. Since 2018, I have worked for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which maybe you have heard of because it's been in the news a lot. There, I have primarily done Section 106 reviews, so ensuring that FEMA-funded undertakings are compliant with the National Historic Preservation Act. And through that, I also became cross-trained on a number of environmental law as well, which I have greatly appreciated in my time at FEMA because it has just allowed me to grow professionally in ways that just limiting myself to preservation wouldn't have allowed me to. So for almost 6 years, I worked in the regional office in Philadelphia, which served a mid-Atlantic portfolio of states. So the projects we reviewed, ranged from in-kind road repairs to acquisition demolition of privately owned properties in the floodplain that folks, did not want to live in anymore due to their flood risk. And property elevations. FEMA, because we're in the Department of Homeland Security, we also have a number of counterterrorism grants that nonprofits can apply for. So for example, synagogues and churches can get grants from FEMA to put security cameras on their buildings. And so if any of those buildings are listed in or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, we have to make sure that any work is compliant with the Secretary of Interior's standards for rehabilitation. For the past year and a half, I've pivoted to serving as a nationwide coordinator for environmental and historic preservation law compliance for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant. Unfortunately, the current administration has eliminated this grant, but I am mysteriously still employed. But I'm trying to find other ways for me to remain useful for the agency at this time. So I always love including other duties as assigned. In these sorts of slides, I don't really put it on my resume anymore, but I think it really encompasses that FEMA is an agency where you really it can be really unpredictable, like what your work can be, but at the same time, you also have the opportunity to deploy and help people when there's a real need for help, and boots on the ground, even if it's not, what I went to grad school for. So in 2021, I worked for 3 or 4 months at the Philadelphia COVID-19 vaccination site, which was just a very humbling and illuminating experience that has nothing to do with historic preservation. And then this year, I was deployed to Florida twice to help with streamlining of a 5,000 plus property elevation program in Florida. So it's an alternative to demolition that homeowners can pursue with FEMA, that they will coordinate with the State Emergency Management Agency to elevate your homes above storm surge, above the floodplain. So a lot of people in Florida live in flood prone areas, or areas, at risk of storm surge and things like that. So in order to avoid consulting with the Florida State Historic Preservation Office for every single building that is, part of this initiative, I worked with the team down there to streamline the historic preservation compliance for that, which included doing a lot of on the ground historic property survey work as part of the mitigation measures that were agreed upon by these agencies to offset any adverse effects that elevation would have on any historic properties. So the dinosaur gas station that you see in the slide is it was not being elevated, but it was part of the survey area that we were in, and it is actually listed on the National Register of Historic Places already, so we don't have to worry about that. But it was really fun seeing the roadside architecture down there, and it was fun getting to Florida a couple times this year. And the last thing I'll mention is that despite working for the federal government, I care deeply about giving back my time, and I want to leverage my privilege of full-time employment with helping illuminate histories that are otherwise neglected in sort of the public history canon, but also just helping out any organization that wants my help. I'm usually happy to do that for free because I have trouble like advocating for, my time and my expertise in like a financial sense, and I just want to help everyone. So I recently gave a talk for the National Trust for Historic Preservation about the use of AI in historic nomination writing. I ended up using AI a little bit in some of my advocacy work. I serve on the board of Repoint Philadelphia, which was founded by the late Aaron Wunsch, who was a professor in the preservation department here at Penn. And just wanted to show you a sampling of different houses and churches that I've nominated to various registers over the years. Actually, the one on the bottom left was an unsuccessful nomination, but I consider it a success because we got a lot of news coverage about it in the Philadelphia Inquirer and Hidden City Philadelphia, other news outlets. So yeah, that pretty much sums me up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So wonderful. So I'll just give a little bit of a background. I think the reason we started to do these types of discussions, particularly as a part of our open house, is that the scale of preservation concerns has really grown exponentially. And we just wanted to hear from a new generation of professionals about how they're leveraging this profession through a diversity of narratives and dimensions. So my first question is, although your broader concerns undoubtedly overlap, each of you practice preservation in a different way. Can you say something about the key questions or concerns that guide your work?
I can go ahead. I think one of the key questions is how we create a new generation, of people that and how we make our work visible within the broader society. One of the challenges that cultural heritage at large has today is that people don't value cultural heritage as much as we think, or they don't even know what historic preservation is, or they have wrong conceptions about preservation at all. So I think the Or my question and my the challenge a little bit is how we make our work accessible to the public and how we engage new audiences so they can support the work that we do.
For me, I'm really interested in how historic preservation can shape better places for everyone and keep people in place despite displacement pressures. I think preservation is not the end all be all to solve that question, but it can contribute to helping keep people in place and articulating why that's important. So I mean, I like probably many or all of you, I really like historic architecture and I really like walkable older neighborhoods with distinctive character. But what feels like it keeps my work really grounded and relevant and exciting and worthwhile are working with other people across disciplines, with community members on a real variety of projects. So it's really collaboration. And I think preservation is such a cool field for that because it overlaps with so many things. Just like yeah. For example, right now in my job, I'm looking at ways to streamline city processes, working across departments, providing clearer and more targeted information to community members at the right times about technical preservation processes, looking at ways to map people's stories onto the local landscape, planning our first annual summit to coordinate implementation of the equity-based preservation plan with a real variety of partners. And also working with partners at our local public access TV station to expand Austinites' awareness about why places matter and what kinds of places matter as the city changes, and trying to expand that past the state capitol and the governor's office and really, huge architect-designed houses in historically wealthier, historically white neighborhoods. So really just trying to look at the landscape. I think a mentor once told me, I was sort of like, what should I do next? What comes next in my job? Like, how do I think about my career path? And he said, just do what's interesting to you. And I think that has been excellent career advice, just to like, what's interesting. And I think keeping preservation people focused and not limiting it to what's designated as historic has been really wonderful.
I'd probably say along the same lines as Cara, a lot of what we do may not count as historic to a national register from that perspective, but I think a lot of the questions that I find myself asking are what's possible. So it's looking at things from much like I think I benefited greatly from Michael Henry's class at Penn about the building pathologies and challenges that structures face, what's physically possible for historic buildings as they migrate to the next chapter of life. But then that holds in contrast with what's responsible, since I think a lot of those two aims are at odds, but can help guide a really interesting project, what is physically able to be done, but then what's the right thing to do by either the building, the community, or the people who are served by it.
I will add to this that I think equity is a big word for me in my kind of professional philosophy. I think historic preservation is often unfairly weaponized by sort of both sides of whether you're for preserving something or against preserving something. I think it's been my goal to kind of meet people where they are and try to like Cara said, kind of get everyone on a level playing field and hopefully impart the idea that preservation is in the public interest. I think we've seen, unfortunately, a shift in society where a lot of people act every day with a what's in it for me kind of mentality. And so where I've worked in many cases where I'll nominate a building and a property owner is opposed to it because, well, what's in it for me? It seems like I'm only getting, the short end of the stick here if you're telling me what to do with my property. And so I try to approach it not in that mindset and try to be as collaborative as possible. And that said, I think that can also be translated to communities that feel development pressure and maybe want to look to historic designation as a way to control development. Whereas I don't think that's necessarily always the right approach, but I want to be there to support whoever I can, especially communities that don't have the resources to hire consultants or things like that. I have the privilege to do that and give that to them. And that's sort of where I stand on that. But yeah, like equity and like the what's in it for me is something I grapple with a lot.
And I think Randy would like to ask the question, the next question.
Yeah, if you guys don't mind, I would just like to kind of make an observation and ask if you each riff on it. It seems like, and it's about the current moment. Obviously, Arielle spoke to it most clearly, is that the federal government changes and challenges to the government roles in historic preservation. Give us pause and challenge us to be more creative, more assertive, more of a lot of things. And one of the things that, in terms of career paths, that strikes me is that we need to be just as open to jobs that don't have preservation in the title as jobs that do have preservation nominally in the title. Recognizing that everyone does preservation in different ways, and sometimes it's formal and sometimes it's informal. So in this moment, that seems more important because the kinds of jobs are likely to shift back and forth for a little while. I don't think the jobs are going to go away in aggregate, but I think there's going to be a kind of reshuffling. How do you guys see that from your perspectives, or am I wrong about it?
I mean, I can jump in as like a current federal employee. I agree with you that the jobs aren't going to go away, but they may be kind of restructured. There was actually a congressional committee meeting last week on the Section 106 process, which, as I explained, you may or may not know, it's the federal compliance review for the National Historic Preservation Act. And one of the senators asked the group, like, should we get rid of Section 106? And even like the private sector, planted guy from sort of the anti-preservationist movement said, no, we should not get rid of Section 106. They all agreed on that. I think everyone understands that large scale projects should have a sort of a similar like big picture analysis of historic resources it affects. I also think that we may also see like a lot of pivoting to like more hyper local groups, like, in terms of like claiming ownership of heritage. It may be like, maybe we'll see a resurgence of like smaller nonprofits or neighborhood organizations that take more of an interest in preservation, especially as, we get headlines about the White House being demolished. And it's like, well, what's happening in our community that, is our White House or maybe isn't our White House, but feels like a White House. So those are sort of my thoughts.
Well, calling out the hyperlocal, I think that points to Cara and Hector. So maybe you guys could take a riff.
Sure. About the overall arc of the preservation workforce, I think that is, I'll keep chewing on that, Randy, but I don't think I'm prepared to say something extremely coherent in front of all of our friends here. But I will say, working in local government, it's very stable. I mean, I should knock on wood with that, but my job is pretty well protected. I will, in a practical way, I think the allies that I work with in development, in the sustainability fields, and deconstruction, and economic development, preservation advocacy, affordable housing, and like working with community archivists, I feel like those are the folks who do some of the most powerful work for preservation, or who have the ability to do some of the most powerful work for preservation, kind of coming in through the back door to achieve other goals, even if preservation isn't at the forefront. So thinking about more historic preservation professionals or graduates going into other fields is a really exciting thing. And I think it puts some useful pressure on the field to have broader conversations and to be more relevant to more people for whom preservation isn't a priority and will never be a priority, which is fair. But looking at how yeah, how it can help achieve other goals. So I say yes, go into fields outside preservation and bring that preservation ethos and kind of ask about how the past can be valued and community heritage can be valued as part of that work.
From my end, I think one of the challenges, at least in my region, is the lack of opportunities or the lack of standards or the knowledge of what is historic preservation is. So a lot of projects right now, for example, are going to firms and contractors and other people that are not prepared with the background of historic preservation. So a little bit the challenges in my hometown is that how we make visible that historic preservation is a discipline, is a profession. We have to comply with federal, local standards for preservation projects. On the other side, I think that um, one of the things that I learned when I was graduating from school is that yeah, we learn a lot about theory, and everything that we learned in master's degree, but for private practice conservators and people that work on the construction field, we need to learn business skills. We need to learn a lot of this other set of skills that I didn't know anything about before I graduated. And it is important because if we don't know this set of skills, we can't make preservation happen. So I think it's important to, yeah, acquire all the knowledge that you can about preservation, but there are other skills outside of the field that are a must in order to, work and develop specific projects. So
Great. Well, we should keep talking about that, Hector. Appreciated. Nate, what about from the private sector perspective? How do you see the prospects?
Yeah, I was gonna, yes, I was actually gonna reference back to what Arielle had said about even at the federal level, how there's awareness for the importance of Section 106 or preservation structures as a way to help make things happen that wouldn't be able to happen otherwise in the private sector. So we work with a lot of private sector developers or private sector partners who I don't think any of them would call themselves preservationists. I don't think that there's any awareness that that's necessarily even a thing for a lot of the new construction or historic property owners that we've met. And a lot of them are in smaller jurisdictions, smaller towns where they may own or have like a family tie to a historic building and have no awareness that either historic tax credit is a process or have any interface with the local preservation officer. So I see it as I see the preservation roles being one where I think that even if you're just a preservation ally, someone who understands the value of the preservation tools, being able to create an opportunity that wouldn't be able to exist otherwise, it's something that I don't see going away, but I think it does merit a little more awareness, at least that at a smaller local level of this is a tool, this is a process of doing things that could leverage opportunities that wouldn't exist otherwise. And specifically in Kentucky, it's housing is a significant need, and we've done work for disaster relief housing or work in even outside Kentucky, work in Huntington, Virginia, where there's old, amazing buildings that both Kentucky and West Virginia at the state, it's a low-income housing tax credit level where they have set asides for historic properties. And it's a way that I think states recognize that there are overlapping incentives that you can provide additional housing and find new uses for old buildings. So I think that there is a state level awareness for a lot of this, but it trickles down more slowly to individual projects, and that it takes a sort of like a team of professionals who are all allied with the end goal, but who may not necessarily individually call themselves preservationists. So that's where I see it most visually represented at the private sector local level.
Fantastic. I'm afraid I have to go to a different meeting now, and I'll pass it back to Callie, but I just want to say how delightful it is to see all of you four back in the room, so to say. And appreciate you giving your advice to not this room has students who are applying, but also some of our first and second year students. So the advice is super valuable, and we really appreciate you being generous with your time. See you again soon in some Zoom room, or maybe even in person soon. Thank you, guys, and excuse me.
Thank you so much, Randy. Thank you. All right, so I'll take over the next couple of questions, and then I also want to make sure we leave time at the end for Q&A. Some of you might have touched on this a little bit, but this is a question that we have here. Given the interdisciplinary nature of preservation, what do you see as the authority and/or the challenges of the preservation professional within what are often mixed project teams? So if you're working with architects, urban planners, etc.
I can go first. One of the challenges, at least for me, has been to learn the language of other disciplines. For example, archaeologists, archivists, curators, art conservators. So I have to work with them on different projects and learning to understand their methodologies, their specific concepts on how they do the work, and also negotiate. Basically, we have to think about how we develop a specific projects, set timelines. It's a little bit challenging. So we learn a lot of specific techniques from other disciplines that we borrow, and we use it in the conservation field. And I think it's important not only to learn the language, but also to ask them for specific help. We need to communicate with them. We need to appreciate the work that they do, and we expect that they appreciate the work that they do. So a little bit of that from my end.
I can go. Oh, go ahead, Nate.
Oh yeah, I think I was actually going to reference the authority as both, like, there's the federal authority, there are the laws, that is the authority in a lot of scenarios, but then it's also the people. And so it's the folks who, whether they even may just be like a community leader or a local representative for the needs of a specific group. I think that those two tied together, and I'd be curious, Arielle, or your opinion as a looking at it from like the legal standpoint as well. But what we see as the authority in a lot of those scenarios is also what allows for a building to maintain its eligibility for historic tax credits. So I think it's those three factors. It's the integrity of a structure, the integrity of maintaining a building's authenticity, but then also the legal framework is the ultimate authority, and then the individuals we work with. Sorry, Arielle, I'd be curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how FEMA operates, projects cannot be obligated until there is confirmation of compliance with all federal environmental laws and executive orders. This can sometimes be difficult for disaster reimbursement projects that have already been completed, but usually those ones have minimal impact on historic resources, are things like debris cleanup, even from within a building. We have streamlined programmatic agreements in place with almost, I think, 49 states. There's one state that still insists that for every FEMA undertaking, they have a formal consultation process, but that pretty much allows us to streamline a lot of projects that are not really likely to affect historic resources. And that includes like below ground resources too. In the cases where we can't really come to an agreement with the applicant, like there's often a lot of like education, outreach, back and forth of like the main things are like when the environmental and historic preservation folks say that an application is not complete on our end, like we don't have the exact location of where work is happening, or we don't know how a security camera is being adhered to a building, or we don't know what types of doors you're replacing that were damaged, things like that. But there are sometimes more controversial projects. One in Delaware that I reviewed several years ago was a bridge that was damaged from the remnants of Hurricane Ida. The Brandywine Creek completely flooded and took out a historic pedestrian bridge that had formerly operated as a railroad bridge in a factory complex. But the community did not care at all about the historic preservation mitigation. They were just like, we want this walking trail back, and we don't care, what kind of bridge is there. FEMA would have paid in to replace it in kind, but because that wouldn't have been a flood resilient design due to the way the truss was set up, the Parks and Rec Department in Delaware opted to replace it with like a precast concrete bridge, which it's fine. It's always sad to see a historic resource go due to climate change, but it was sort of an inevitability at this point. And our group did a lot of outreach, not just with the applicant, the Parks and Rec Department, but also the broader community to explain, like, this is why you may feel that the project is delayed, but it's actually perfectly on schedule, that sort of thing. Generally, like, my team at FEMA gets critiqued due to like the supposed like delays in project obligation and completion, but sometimes it's that it wasn't like built out on the back end to accommodate for that time spent to review. So yeah, Nate, I don't know if that addressed exactly what you said, but that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of like interdisciplinary collaboration.
I'll say that so as I mentioned, I used to do regulatory work with the city of Austin. So compliance with city code, following historic zoning standards, working to make sure projects complied with our historic design standards and the Secretary of the Interior's standards for historic rehabilitation, the stuff that I think, Arielle, is your bread and butter on the federal end. Now my job around equity-focused preservation planning, there aren't really formal standards or formal authority that I hold. And I'm not reviewing projects that have to move through on a specific timeline per city code. And I'll just say, I think the authority that I bring to rooms is sometimes a little bit of a pretend authority, or that's based on the work that I've done. But I think it really, what I'm able to contribute to conversations is about people. And when you mentioned thinking about clients or users of a property or like inhabitants of a space, I think I do a lot of work with community voices and try to model community-oriented, people-focused outreach and engagement processes that go beyond checking a box, which we have to do as the city, and certainly like all levels of government have to do some outreach, at least to inform people what's happening at certain times. So when I find myself in interdisciplinary teams with other city departments or with community partners or stakeholder organizations, I really try to ask questions about who's been invited, what's being done to make these engagement opportunities meaningful, what additional ways that people who are impacted can be involved. And I think that I can bring in my preservation. I mean, anyone can do that. I think it's a good role for all of us to play when we speak with any authority. But I think, especially with a preservation background, it enables me to bring in the lens of the past and talk about equity in a way that is really grounded in what has happened in the past, how we got where we got, particularly around engaging historically marginalized communities in big decisions or small decisions, and to really look at possibilities with that equity lens and community focus. Like Arielle, I got a certificate in urban redevelopment when, in addition to my master's in historic preservation, and I think that really modeled how to work with folks across disciplines to meet a wide range of goals. Sometimes historic preservation, in those courses and in real life, is at the center of things, and like that's the end goal, but usually it's not. And so it was extremely valuable to practice identifying areas of overlap and potential, and being imaginative about partnerships, and again, kind of basing all of that on a lens of what has happened and what's possible given history, and how we can build on heritage in a collaborative way.
That was great. Thank you guys so much. I just have a couple more questions before I open it up. I think all of you talked a little bit about community engagement community partners. And I was just curious, what are some important lessons that you've learned? Because I'm sure there's a balance between, what the community says they really need in place and what you bring from your knowledge. Like, what are some important lessons, I guess, that you've learned with community engagement?
I guess I can start with this. I've done a lot of community engagement in my career, certainly in Austin now. Before, when I worked in Seattle, I did a lot of community engagement there. And I think a big lesson learned is that it's very complicated. It's very, very complicated, and that as professionals, it's really tempting to say, what does the community want? What does the community want? And then to take one answer, when in reality, you might have, if you have a community of 5,000 people or 50,000 people, you're going to have, say, if in a community of 50,000 people, you're going to have 70,000 perspectives. Like everyone, like people are complicated, and it's you're not going to hear all the 70,000 perspectives, but not to stop just with the loudest voice in the room. And I think that comes down, it often comes down to privilege, is like who's heard, who has the microphone, who knows what language to use to sound really credible. And that means that people who have not historically been involved in historic preservation or the kind of projects that we're working on, who are part of communities that have historically been marginalized, who've had terrible experiences with, say, city government in the past, are much less likely to come to the table if we don't do a lot of extra work, not only to invite people, but to create a situation where people are comfortable being there and contributing. So when we put together the preservation plan working group that wrote the new equity-based preservation plan for Austin. So a consultant did not write that plan. It was written by this 26-member community working group. We set aside a budget to pay people. It's not consultant level dollars, but still we paid them for meeting time and preparation time because we knew that some people would need time to get up to speed. In the application for the working group, we we were very careful to not use formal terminology about historic preservation and talk about community heritage and local history, and tried to get, if you care about your neighborhood, you may be interested in this. And so really tried to open it up to people who were not actually interested in historic preservation, but were super into community heritage, who felt really connected to the city, whose families had been here for generations. So we didn't put professional qualifications in place. There were no professional standards. And then when we had the working group, we had 150 people apply for this working group, which is very unusual for any city process in Austin and is especially unusual for historic preservation. People applied from across the city, also very unusual. It was a really cool group, and staff, we spent a lot of time putting together background briefs for them. And we started with, what is historic preservation? What does it do? What is a preservation plan? What does it do? And really just starting from the basics, not because people are stupid, but just because lots of people didn't actually know what historic preservation is or does, because we as a field have not, I think, been great at talking about it in non-jargony ways or broad ways, to raise sort of general community awareness. So yeah, we put together a lot of these background briefs, and that just trying to make sure that we had invited people to come to the table, that we were setting the table, that we were really providing people with the information they needed in super accessible ways, accessible language with graphics. We weren't just stitching together PDFs to be like, read these 16 articles or these 5 articles, and then you can participate, So yeah, and then we hired a professional facilitator, someone who brought those real skills. And then we followed up with people, and we were really, I have a lot to say about community engagement. I'll just say that one more thing, which is that I think it's so important and so necessary for our work to succeed, for people to understand why it's valuable to them, even if they don't own or work in a historic property, or care about historic architecture necessarily. But when we do community engagement, it's really important to be clear about what we're asking and to not overpromise. If we're only asking for feedback, if only one tiny thing can be changed in a process, to be very clear about that. for the preservation plan, we were really lucky in that we had department support and city support to say, you're going to write the plan, and then that's what it will be, you know, like this community working group wrote that. We got also input from thousands of Austinites on the draft plan, and then the working group revised the plan, recommended it to our Historic Landmark Commission. It went up and got adopted by City Council, but so they didn't actually have many guardrails, you know, it wasn't, we as staff were not the arbiters of what went in the plan, but there are processes, city processes, you know, where we say we do want to engage the community, but we're actually not looking for them to develop a whole thing, or we cannot change some things in this process. So just to be really clear, and I think that helps to it helps us to partner with the community in an honest way. If community members don't believe that, if they don't, if we all have the same understanding about what their power is and what their agency is, and it clears the way for us to ask again, like, here's, you know, when we might have a broader scope or not. Okay, really talk for a long time about engagement work. I think it's so exciting.
That's great, Kara. I think that from a community engagement standpoint, that's not my forte. That's architects traditionally are not that great at community engagement, but I think that we find ourselves most often in the role less of a mirror reflecting things back at people of what they say, and less as and more in a role of a synthesizer, trying to take in a bunch of different opinions and try to synthesize into something that no one person may have had the vision for at the beginning. We also, most of our role in design professional work in preservation context feels sometimes like a marriage counselor, where we don't generally have a single client with a single vision and knows what they want. It's usually 10 clients and 3 neighbors and 2 elected officials, and you have to keep them all happy in a way that doesn't ruin the marriage. So it's not clean, but I do think that knowing the language and being able to describe it in a way. I had a professor who said, if you can't describe it to your mom, you probably shouldn't be saying it. So being able to describe something in a way that is relatable and feels human and removes a lot of the jargon, but also can help tell a captivating story that no one person may have been able to tell otherwise. That's generally where I find my work.
All right, I think Micah has our last question before we open it up to the students.
Yes, we are eager to hear from you students. And actually, Kaylee and I both have the same questions. Just where we want to end, I know we have a lot of current students and a lot of prospective students on the call and these great minds here. And we wanted to ask you guys if you had one piece of advice to give to either someone entering the program or about to enter the preservation workforce, what would that be?
I'll say it to anyone who I did a number of internships while I was a student, and I would give the feedback to anyone who is a current student or prospective student, is that being in an academic environment opens a lot of doors that would be closed otherwise. And that as a student or even as an interested student, expressing your interest in what you want to do to someone who you know is doing something that fascinates you and interests you, you are going to be in a position that later in your career, you may not always have the ability to ask someone, can I come by your office and see what you do? Or could I shadow you for an afternoon? Or could I grab a coffee with you? And I think the virtue of being a student is exciting to a lot of professionals because they get to learn from interested young minds. But also you as a student have the opportunity to speak with people who you may not have otherwise been able to. So I found that personally at Penn, at least, that Penn opens a lot of doors that would be closed otherwise. It was true in a thesis setting, but it was also true in a professional setting. So I would encourage anyone who's looking at what's out there, take a bold step and reach out to someone who you really find doing interesting work, because now's the time to do it. It's the best opportunity when you're a student or even considering going to graduate school and pursuing a program. People want to tell you what they do, and people want to learn from you, and you'll have the opportunity to learn from them.
Yeah, to piggyback off of Nate, I would say in addition to, like, you know, expanding your network as much as possible, something that I don't think I like intentionally thought about, but like in comparing myself to like in comparing the preservation department to other departments in the School of Design was like having a portfolio of your work when you graduate. You know, for an architect, it's very easy to say like, these are the projects I did in my classes, but you might, depending on what classes you do take, especially in your electives, you may not have the opportunity to, you know, produce material that would be suitable for a portfolio. You know, a lot of the city planning classes I took and, you know, preservation law, it's like those don't leave you with like a tangible product at the end. Or you know, I think about the preservation economics class I took, and it's like, okay, well, like we did a potential like financial analysis of a building for a property development project. But I feel like in the core curriculum, there are a lot of opportunities to actually like move forward with your work and have it, you know, contribute to scholarship and things like that. So in the documentation class, for example, you're going to be asked to, you know, produce a local register or a national register nomination for a building somewhere in Philadelphia. It's like, go ahead and complete that and submit it to the Historical Commission or submit it to the National Register, because, you know, should that get approved, you can graduate saying that like you've already, you know, done professional level documentation work. So yeah, I would definitely try to explore that as much as you can.
I would, I think, expand a little bit on what Arielle was saying, is that a portfolio is really important. I think as much practical experience as you can gain with internships is really great, especially if you're coming in not having worked in a related field before. Although I think most of us can tell a straight line. You know, I worked in a cafe and that really taught me this, and so I did this, and so I think anyway that's kind of a fun project, pretty much at any point in your career. But I think really looking at internships as ways to gain that hands-on experience. Philadelphia is really rich ground for all sorts of organizations doing preservation work, doing related work. I found Penn's program was, you know, one of the best in the country. Someone maybe possibly the best. I don't know, but coming to Philadelphia was almost as strong an argument as UPenn's curriculum. It was just such a great city to be in, and to learn from various internships in the city itself. I think as you're looking for those internships, really cast a broad net for opportunities. You know, what it may not have preservation in the title, but if it's interesting work and it relates to the built environment or community history or public history, I think that can be really relevant. And I would just say also do informational interviews with anyone whose work that you find exciting. And that speaks a little bit to what Nate was saying, is, you know, as a student, you can say, let's have coffee. I'd love to, or let's meet virtually for half an hour. I'd love to learn what you do and how you got there. People love to talk about themselves. So really leveraging informational interviews. Yeah, I think those are two very practical pieces of advice that kind of layer on what y'all have heard.
From my perspective, I agree with the colleagues. Networking is a must. You know, you're in a unique opportunity right now on meeting new people, new professionals, learning so much from conferences, events. So that's definitely the top choice. But my other thing is that if you're at Penn and, for example, if you're interested in the conservation science track, my recommendation is that you look outside of the program. I mean, Penn right now has a lot of other departments and schools and interesting courses that are really accessible for anyone in the history preservation department. For example, I know colleagues that that are more interested in the planning or public policy side, so they go to Wharton to take some courses. The conservation folks, there is a certificate in the Graduate School of Arts and Science, which is, I think, archaeological science. I learned about that after I graduate from school. So, but if I had the chance, I'll do it because it complements very well with all the conservation track courses at the program. So that's my advice? Look for other opportunities outside of the program.
Great. I'm just gonna put before I open the chat, I'm just gonna put a couple of links in the chat here because we do have career services through Penn. So we have Penn General Career Services and also Weitzman Career Resources. So I'll put those links in the chat. And with that, I'll open it up if you all have any questions for our guests, our alumni guest speakers. You can open your microphone or push the hand up or turn your camera on, whatever is easiest, or put it in the chat. Okay, Grace, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Oh, wait, let me turn on my camera. Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. My first question is, sorry, I wrote my questions down. So I wanted to know, how has your understanding of preservation changed between like when you were a student and now? Thank you.
There are definitely, frankly, things I'm more jaded about, and there are things I'm more optimistic about. Yeah, I can, elaborate on any of that, but it's a careful balance to not get burnt out, especially in the advocacy space. If you have like whether it's a legal loss or a literal loss of a building or a loss of a person, sometimes you think like, regulations are there for a reason, and sometimes they also haven't changed for a reason. So it's just about learning to accept the balance in this career of, a win and a loss is sort of how I would frame that.
I think how it's changed for me would be, I felt like when I graduated and went through all the programs, I could write my own nomination, I could do my own documentation, I could investigate the building, I could help design the new components to it, and I'd be there for the whole process and meet with everyone along the way. And I realized, oh my goodness, there are so many people who get involved in a project that, as much as I feel like I could do this all myself, it's really like a network and a interconnected field of people who are all usually working on each of those things in parallel. And maybe to Hector's point, I think that I benefited while I was at Penn from having friends who were in allied roles, who were in public policy or who had insight in material science. So I think I benefited as much from having those conversations and getting to know people who are now working in areas that they are a expert in and that I could come to with a question. And that as much as I would love to write a nomination, I am not suited for that as a professional. My skills lie elsewhere, but I learned it. And I think that that's one thing that has changed for me as I've graduated is look for allies and look for people who really can be a champion for something and a collaborator. So I think that the program suits you really well to set you up for any number of tracks and areas of expertise, but look for partners, and that's what's going to make something really successful.
I'll say that I think as I've this I think comes at the point that Nate just made in a different way, that as I've gained more experience and expertise and credentials, I've also I think become more savvy about how to get things done, working in tough systems, systems that are not necessarily built to change quickly or to include everyone or to, end up with always the best outcome, that systems just accrete over time, especially in city government, but also in broader politics as well. So I think I've become it's tempting to want to be right straight off and to have the right answers straight off, but I think I've become aware and I'm always practicing asking what a good process looks like and how I can be curious and collaborative and create a team of people that is aimed at basically the same thing, rather than me just saying, I have the answer, here's what we should do, here's where we should go, right? This is it. Because even if that's true, even if it is right and it is where we should go, if I haven't built a coalition of folks who agree with me, if I haven't invited the right people, then we're probably not going to get there. And maybe it's actually not the right place to go. Maybe it's the right answer. Maybe it's the best answer I can come up with, but it's actually not the best one overall. So I think being curious instead of right straight off.
From my perspective, since I have to work not only with buildings but other type of cultural heritage, my vision of what cultural heritage in general has changed in terms of that. For example, the art conservation world and the built heritage world, we do the same thing in terms of protecting, preserving, even a building or a work of art. The thing is that we don't talk to each other a lot. And we're facing the same threats, the same issues, the same challenges. So from my perspective is that we need to communicate more with other colleagues. And I will say that after I graduated, definitely my vision of what preservation and cultural heritage means, like, broaden it. So that's my 2 cents there.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Great. Do you have any other questions? You can put it in the chat or just turn your microphone on, whatever is easiest.
Hi, I would like to ask a question. Sorry. Yes, hi. Thank you for all your perspectives. I come from an art conservation background. I wanted to know that I'm kind of pivoting towards architecture, which I have an undergraduate background in as well. I wanted to know how much focus is given in conservation practice to technical and scientific studies on materials, and are there career opportunities in that area?
I will say that Penn gave me a great foundation on how to use specific technologies, what analytical testing I can use for specific projects, or to evaluate or to do a specific assessments. But it was an introduction. I think we keep learning after we graduate from school to look at specific information that we need. So basically Penn give us the foundation to look for other type of information that we need for specific projects. And that's important because if you don't know where to look at or how to answer your questions, your project will not come to it. So regarding the industry, I feel that architectural conservation as materials science field is still small in the US and abroad. But there are definitely opportunities specifically for internships and opportunities at the private sector more than it is in the public sectors right now, specifically the federal government. So, but you have to do the networking to end up doing. If you want to do bench conservation work, you need to do networking, because a lot of people go into the program thinking, hey, I want to do the conservation track and I will end up working on a historic mural paintings and do stuff. That's not the reality. The reality is that we do much more, and those type of projects and positions are not that accessible to everyone. So
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much. There is a question in the text, or in the chat box, excuse me. Hi, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the differences or overlaps between preservation and adaptive reuse. And that is from Camilla. Thanks, Camilla.
Yeah, I could probably speak on some of this. Adaptive reuse is a term that I did not even know existed until I went to school. It's not something that people generally throw around as in the cultural way that people talk about historic buildings. But I think that the overlap is pretty fair to think of it as you can do an adaptive reuse project that doesn't satisfy the Secretary of the Interior standards, but if you want to be eligible for historic tax credits, you do have to satisfy the Secretary of Interior's standards. And the term for preservation, that would be one of the different approaches that fall under those Secretary standards for historic preservation. So there's not that I'm aware of a Secretary of the Interior standards for adaptive reuse. You would comply with the standards if you are doing an adaptive reuse project. So I think that there is an overlap. There's a big overlap. You can do a preservation project that is not adaptive reuse. So you could take a historic home and keep it as a historic home, or you can take a historic office and keep it as a historic office. And adaptive reuse, as I've always understood it, would be taking something that had one function and adapting it to another function. So preservation tends to be the very literal or specific way of maintaining continuity of what's there. Usually that does entail the same function. But if the function changes, that's a great way to think of adaptive reuse when a building goes from doing one thing to doing something else. I do think that there is a distinct difference though, because not every building, or not every you can do an adaptive reuse project for a building that's not on a national register. So your own house, I mean, you could change your house into a daycare, you could change your house into a brewery, but if it's not a historic building, you wouldn't qualify as a historic tax credit project. It would just be adaptive reuse. So it's a term that I think is gaining more traction and recognition as people realize that we have a lot of old or substantial office buildings that could use from different functions for housing or for commercial functions or cultural functions, or for big box buildings that never had the set of criteria that would qualify as a historic landmark or as listing on the National Register. You could still take a big box building and do an adaptive reuse project into a new library or into a new community center. But I think that I would love to talk about that. I feel like that is a lot of my job, is where is that line? Because a lot of people will take historic buildings and look for ways that they can push the limit on what still would qualify as a Secretary of the Interior standard for preservation and still be able to do something new. So I think that is a rich area for decades of future work. And I think that will only grow as the country's building stock expands. So I would love to answer more of those questions. Camilla, if you have any more specifics, feel free to reach out.
Great. I think we probably have time for maybe one more question, Micah. I think we're on schedule though, but
Yep.
Anyone have a last question for our guests?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Maybe I am the last person to ask something. Okay, so I'm Nisa. I'm from Bangladesh, and I have completed my bachelor's of architecture. And I have some experience in conservation in my country. And recently, we have achieved some international awards, Holcim awards for the conservation project. So after hearing the experience of the renowned architects or another experts here in historic preservation, I have some thoughts actually based on your experience, that what is the scope of the design studio in the MS in Historic Preservation program in UPenn? Because most of the time, as an architect, we want to do some design for the heritage buildings. Because most of the time, what is the urban policy depends on the heritage buildings. We try to make them as a frozen museum, like there will be no accessibility and there will be a museum, not another use. So in that perspective, what can be done in this program, that how I can get some insights from this program, that what can I do rather than making some frozen museums of that heritage building. So sorry, my question is very long, but I think I'm sharing some my thoughts and to know from you.
Yeah, that's a good
Thanks.
question. I mean, I'm almost 10 years out of the program, and I know that it's changed since I've been there, and there are now new degrees offered in the preservation department that weren't there when I was there. But in terms of the classes, like the classes I do have experience with, every preservation student is required to take a studio. That studio does not necessarily mean that you're doing design work, but it's more dependent on the site that's selected for you. So in my cohort, we had a former power plant that a lot of the conservation kids did, and by kids I mean adults. The students did different conditions analyses of things. Folks who were dual degree in architecture looked at different reuse options, event spaces, things like that. The studio I was assigned to was the Philadelphia Navy Yard. So folks with more of like the architecture background maybe looked at how to reuse some of the abandoned buildings at that site. But the primary focus of that studio is to create what's called a preservation plan. And there's a rubric for that that's followed, but generally then each individual student also produces an individual piece of work that complements the preservation plan.
Yeah, I'd echo that too. And maybe Callie or Micah, if as Arielle was talking about, I know that there's the Master of Science and Design Historic Preservation option. That would probably be something that's worth considering. Zana told you your question about where's a good track for exploring design questions with the background in material science. I think that I benefited at least from options. So when I was in the program with Arielle and Hector, the studios were options. So I'm not sure how it's set up currently, but there were 3 options, and each one had a unique blend of it's in a different place. Like one studio was very close to campus and one was very far away. So you could go somewhere or you could stay close to home. And each of the studio options also offered opportunities, no matter what your interest, to find a way to contribute to the larger team project. So we had more, when I was a student, more of a design focused or a planning focused studio, but there were still options for people within that to look at how is material conservation applied for mid-century buildings. It was mid-century Philadelphia through the guise of Edmund Bacon, but people looked at historic homes and how they'd been conserved, but also then how could they be updated, as you're talking about, for accessibility or for environmental considerations. So I think there's a way that you can find a track within a studio and within the options of several studios to see which topic fits your interest the most.
And Micah added a link as well to the chat. Micah, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just say you guys, even though you've been out for the program and things have changed, I think you captured the heart of the studio well, and that the studio, there's different sites, and I think in terms of the projects, they do vary, and they are, so there's 2 studios. You have your required studio for all students in the fall of the second year, and that has different sites that you choose from, and then those students in the preservation design track do a secondary studio that is a little more design focused. You're doing more I'm sorry, my words are escaping me today, but more drawings and things like that is the final project, whereas the required studio for everyone, there's elements of preservation that's involved and public history. So I think the breadth of the studio is a little bit wider. As Kaylee said, I put a link in the chat where you can see all the different studios. All the ones that say capstone studio are those design specific studios, whereas all the other ones are just an example of sort of the wide variety of sites and projects and different things that are open to students. And any current second year students who are in studio are welcome to chime in as well in the chat if I got anything wrong.
And with that, we are coming up on time. I just wanted to say thank you so very much to all of our alumni panelists. This has been an amazing chat. I hope all of the attendees have gotten some really great information. I learned a lot as well. And we just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
for everyone who's part of the open house, there's one final session, which is the admissions and financial aid session from 12:30 to 1:30. So hopefully you have a bit of time to stretch your legs, get some lunch quickly, and then that Zoom should be in your email from the admissions office.
Awesome. Thank you, Micah. Thanks again,
Thanks
everyone.
again.
Enjoy your day. Take care. Bye.
Bye.